Have you ever looked at a build and thought there was something missing? Some key element that could transform your build, make it pop, and bring it to life? Because the thing you're missing is one of the most common and prevalent mistakes in building, and yet, in a paradoxical manner, one of the easiest to fix. And it all comes down to the one thing that seems simple, but never is: color. At its heart, using color in a build seems simple. You want to build a large stone castle, so you use stone bricks. However, truly using color in an artistic sense, in a way that makes your builds leap off the screen, requires a more foundational knowledge of how color actually works. Let's start by considering what color actually is. In art, color is defined by its relationship with three ideas: hue, value, and chroma. They're the type of thing that seems complicated, but in reality, you've probably experienced them every day. Let's start with the first one, hue. Hue is, quite simply, what a color is. In fact, when we think of color, hue is the main way we describe it. For example, if I have an apple, I would say the apple is red. I would not say it is high chroma or medium value. So to put it simply, hue is where it falls on the rainbow, from red to green to purple. Next, we have value. Value is generally defined by how close to black or white a color is. We generally think of it as how light or dark a color is. For example, yellow usually has a very high value, it's quite close to white. However, a navy blue generally has a very low value, which is why it's sometimes called dark blue. If we plot the two of these on an axis, we get what is called a color wheel, like the one shown here. It is also important to note that some color wheels just show hue, but we'll talk about that later. Finally, we have chroma, which is more commonly called saturation. This, in turn, is generally how vibrant a color is, and is thought of as the amount of gray of the same value as a color has. Now, if we plot all three of these, we arrive at a multitude of ways of representing color called color spaces, such as the Munsell system. However, I'm simply representing it by showing these three color wheels, which are high, medium, and low chroma, respectively. Now, this brings us nicely into color wheels. Most color wheels you see will look like this, showing red, yellow, and blue as the three primary colors, while the colors arranged between them. However, this ignores two things. The first is that red, yellow, and blue are not actually a great set of primary colors. The second is that this does not actually match the perceived differences between colors. Instead, I'll be using this color wheel, which I briefly showed before. Also, I would like to mention that this color wheel was made by Florent Farges, who has an amazing YouTube art channel, which will be linked down here in the description. This particular one comes from a video that heavily inspired this one, and deals with a lot of interesting information about color wheels. That video will also be linked in the description, and I heavily recommend checking it out, but only after you finish this one. Now, what I have done with this one is to add this bit at the bottom dealing purely with values, and I plotted the rough location of most Minecraft blocks. Now, what this color wheel allows us to do is to accurately plot and realize most colors in Minecraft. Now, you also may notice that some of the locations are weird, especially involving some of the inverse colors. On this simple color wheel, red and green are shown to be opposites, but on this one, it is shown to be red and cyan. This can actually be observed by a simple test. If you stare directly at this dot for 10 to 20 seconds, it helps to focus on one thing. You will see the colors reverse in a moment. This is due to a visual effect called color after images, whereby you see the opposite color to a color that just disappeared. Now that we have a basic understanding of color theory and the color wheel, we can begin to combine them in ways that make them more interesting. These are known as color schemes, and are various combinations of colors that are aesthetically pleasing. The first, and simplest, is known as the analogous color scheme. Usually, this involves using colors that are adjacent on the color wheel. For example, the wall here uses sandstone and birch, two colors that are both between yellow and orange on the color wheel. This is the advantage of using analogous colors. They tend to look very aesthetically pleasing next to each other. This is because they are similar in color, which makes them blend well with each other. This makes them ideal for texturing, which I will cover later. The next color scheme is complementary, or contrasting, which involves using colors from opposite sides of the color wheel. For example, the roof actually contains both prismarine and highlights of copper blocks, which are nearly on opposite sides of the color wheel. The roof also complements the spruce beams, which are also near the opposite side of the color wheel and have a different value. This also shows a key principle of contrast. The contrast can also be in value, not just hue. However, I will talk more about contrast in later chapters of this video. Sometimes the complementary scheme can look too contrasting. A solution to this is the split complement. This is similar to the complement, but there are two colors that are close to being complementary, as shown here. This can be useful if you're using multiple colors and functions similarly to the complementary scheme, but it can avoid the issue of having a contrast that stands out too much. The final color scheme that I'm going to talk about is the triadic. This is similar to the split complementary, but all of the colors are equally spaced. This can work well and has a very vibrant look. The most common is blue, yellow, and red, common in superheroes, and a combination of purple, green, and orange is also quite common. It is useful if you want to have very bright, saturated colors and really want to make them pop. But while these are all nice tips, using a color wheel isn't that useful. It's what we do with the colors we pick that gets interesting. Once we have some basic colors picked out, we now have to use them to compose our builds, and we'll start with the first thing to bear in mind, contrast. Contrast is something essential to the build, and often something that is overlooked. When building, it is often tempting to use an analogous color scheme, using only colors that look similar to avoid any contrasts that stand out. However, contrasts serve an important role in many builds. What a contrast does, in essence, is it breaks up the monotony of your structure and gives your eye something to look at. When using only one color or multiple similar ones, a contrast is also needed to provide interest to a build. Here, we can see that the copper roof contrasts the yellowish sand and sandstone from a hue standpoint, and the spruce contrasts it from a value standpoint. Now, this brings me to my next point. Contrast can be in hue or saturation. For example, maybe you wanted to make a modern structure using white concrete, gray concrete, and ice. In this case, you could use cyan terracotta to contrast these colors because it fits the color scheme but still adds contrast. Also, it's useful to know that value is actually by far the most important factor in determining how something looks. For example, if we take the image of this castle and put it in black and white, we can still tell what it is. However, if we put it all the same color and show the saturation, it is nearly impossible to tell what it is. In this sense, it is most important to have different values in your build, more so than different colors, as we saw with the modern build. Also, this relates to our next point, that saturation shouldn't be too high. In this castle, for example, most of the colors are in the mid-chrome range. If you only use high saturation colors, your build will be too vibrant and will lack contrast in value and depth. Thus, while you can still use blocks with high saturation, they should be used as highlights, not as the main structure of the build. One of the things saturation and value are both good for is identifying the foreground and background of your build, which in building are probably better thought of as the details and the background, since actual location in relation to the viewer is less important. In general, you want some parts of your build to stand out, and others just to serve as the structure. In this example, we use the more saturated and contrasting spruce wood to frame the windows, which themselves are bright colors. This helps them stand out from the rest of the build. Here, we can see that the window frames are just sandstone. In this application, it is clear that they do not stand out from the background of the structure as much as the others. Also, note how the high saturation of the windows helps them pop out from the sandstone walls, and how the entrance to the castle is framed in darker blocks. Both of these help further distinguish details from the background. This brings me to another important principle of color composition, the 60-30-10 rule. What this basically states is that in any structure, 60% should be the background, 30% should be the tonic or foreground, and 10% should be an accent color. And while these numbers do not have to be exact, they can serve as a useful guide for which colors to use. For example, in this castle, most of the build is sand or sandstone. That would be considered the dominant or background. There are also bits of spruce wood that make up the details and serve to contrast the sandstone, so it would be considered to be the foreground or tonic. Finally, there are a few different accent colors. The first are the different blue blocks that make up the roof and banners. The other would be the purple and magenta of the glass. And while there are probably more of these than the spruce, I'm considering this the accent because of the purpose it serves and the fact that it has higher saturation. Also, this is a good time to note that the background should generally be less saturated, the foreground should be more saturated, and the accents should be very saturated, even though all of the colors except glass fall in the mid-chroma range on the color wheel. Now, all of this has been very useful for a color planning point. However, much of the magic of color comes from mixing it at a micro scale. This is, of course, the hardest part of understanding color, being able to use variations and clever tricks and to implement them well. So, with that, let us dive into the world of color tricks and techniques to go beyond the planning of a build. First, I want to touch on the use of value to show depth. This is something I've mentioned in previous videos, but I want to go into more detail now. When our eyes perceive depth, we use a combination of monocular and binocular cues, or things that require one eye or both, respectively. The most well-known and most prominent of these is the difference between what our eyes see, from which we can triangulate distance, a binocular cue. However, Minecraft is just on one screen, so we need to utilize monocular cues. Of these, some work better than others. Triangulation by movement just happens when you move in-game, but our goal here is to exaggerate the depth and even create forced perspective. Now, colors tend to lighten for objects farther away, but Minecraft builds can be viewed from any angle, unlike a painting or photograph. Also, things far away seem less detailed, but that is also rendered useless by moving about. However, Minecraft has one weakness that we can exploit, and that is how it renders shadows. You see, in real life, inset areas are darker, even large ones like recesses in cliffs or cracks. However, Minecraft only renders light level, which in these situations would not make much of a difference, and shadows in the corner of blocks. However, what we can do is make these inset areas darker to create forced perspective that Minecraft lacks, and to add more depth to our builds. Here, we can see I use darker areas in these wall insets to show depth, but it's not only limited to these types of structures. For example, in the sea cave and arch, I used darker blocks just to show some slight depth in the cliff and to shadow the recess of the arch in a way that looks more realistic. Also, it makes the cave here seem deeper than it actually is. Now, this is only scratching the surface of forced perspective, so make sure to leave a comment if you want to see another video on this topic. Also, another thing to bear in mind when building is contrast. As I touched on earlier, you should make sure your build has contrasting colors or values. However, let's shift from viewing our builds in the theoretical sense of color schemes and instead view them as different elements. You see, what contrast allows us to do are to differentiate different parts of the build. For an example of this, let's look at the castle. First, the base color of this castle is a light yellow, which in real life would be the brick part. Now, what is a separate element of the castle? Let's start with the first one, the roof. The roof is a bright blue color, which provides a contrast in hue. What this allows us to do is distinctly tell the difference between the roof and the main body of the castle. In other words, what contrast does is it allows us to see all of the different parts of the build in a way color coding makes it easier to see. By making different elements contrast, it defines for us where all of those elements are, which is especially useful for a rather crowded building like this one. Now, let's consider the spruce. The spruce serves as an extra detail and breaks up the structure of the build. For this, however, the goal is not to create two distinct parts of a build. So we are just using a contrast in value by using the darker wood, which provides the same effect without looking too jarring. Also, note how the windows are a distinctly different color so that they can be identified as a different part of the build. Now, you can also have contrast in chroma. For example, look at this mountain cabin I made in my last video, link in the description. Here, while the stone is the same value and hue, kind of the wood, it effectively has no saturation. This serves both the realism purpose of it being quite normal to see a stone foundation for such a structure, and the artistic purpose of again delineating that it is a separate part of the build. However, note how the spruce is once again used as a detail accent color to the oak structure. However, there is another use of contrast I haven't mentioned, the ability to use contrast of hue to increase the perception of contrast in value, or vice versa. For example, consider this arch. At first glance, it seems to be made of sandstone and birch planks. However, I used some of the forest depth mentioned earlier with oak planks to add shadows. However, the darkest shadows are actually blue terracotta, while the rest of the build is yellow. While you don't notice this unless you know to look for it, it adds more contrast to the value difference already there. Also, using hue like this can just make a build look cool. For example, if you were to create a desert landscape at dusk, it would look far cooler if the highlights of a rock were in vibrant orange, while the shadows were a deep purple. That interest with the color exaggerates the contrast and gives many of the aesthetic benefits of gradients, and you can see a previous video up here for more about them. Also, if you do want to see more of this type of content and support the channel, please do consider subscribing, as it helps this channel a lot. Now that we have that rather heavy material out of the way, it's time to move on to two useful tips to bear in mind when building. The first is known as optical color mixing. What this basically is how your body mixes colors in your eyes. Take, for example, this image of blue and yellow circles. If you decrease the circle size, what happens is eventually the circles all blend into one color. This is in fact how the screen you are watching this on works. There are a series of red, blue, and green pixels that blend to create the colors on the screen. Now, there are a few different ways to use this. The first is commonly referred to as texturing, using a variety of different but similar looking blocks to add visual interest to a build. This is technically called broken color, but I'll use the two interchangeably. Now, the advantage of broken color is that it can add visual interest to your builds. It can allow for unique combinations of textures and colors in a way that can significantly expand the blocks you build with, which is especially useful in a game that doesn't have that many blocks. However, you can also increase the scale to add visual interest. For example, this can be seen in BOO's dystopian house in Hermitcraft Season 10. In it, he uses a base color of stripped spruce logs and then adds green and purple concrete, spruce planks, and acacia logs. What this does is creates different patches of color to still contribute to the same effect as broken color, but without one of the main disadvantages. If you're just texturing, using blocks that are too different can make a build look very rough or too textured. By using patches of colors and blending them together, like I've done on the roof, you can still achieve the same effect while also adding variation and interest to the color. When doing this, it is important to keep a good size, which partially depends on the overall size of the surface, and to blend the colors together slightly, like I've done here. Overall, the trick to this is just to keep a good balance and make sure it looks natural. Now, knowing color theory is all well and good, but it's also useful to know how to implement this in your creative process and actually build things. So if you want to learn how to start with your color palettes and take them all the way to finished builds, click this video here. And since you made it this far, do consider leaving a like if you enjoyed the video.